Hypothetically, are we fixated on culture? This question required thinking deeply. As a consequence, I went beyond what I think I know and let go of preconceived ideas of hypothetically, are we fixated on culture in order to discover the truth. In cultivating the skill of deep thinking, I have gained freedom of thought. The deeper my thinking becomes, the more I am focused and to make sense of and interpret whether hypothetically we are fixated on culture, if indeed and in fact we are, then this becomes a presupposition question that is very complex. That being the case, it is also logical to assume that culture in this context is not a fixed subject, but maybe comporting itself as a conditional proposition. Conversely, since culture is not fixed, but is juxtaposed against this presupposition question becomes the underpinning of this conversation and may fringe on or be interpreted through the paradox lens. In this ambience, a paradox is also used to illustrate my opinion and my statement contrary to accepted traditional ideas. However, in this context, if the same is a paradox, invariably it will make me think over this question. Hypothetically, are we fixated on culture in this innovative way? For clarification, fixation in this environment is viewed through the lens of behavior and cognitive combined. They are viewed as the major elements of culture, namely symbols, language, norms, values, and artifacts. These are elements which would contribute in some way to this concept and or object or way of thinking and determine whether hypothetically we are fixated on culture or not. Language makes effective social interaction possible and influences how people conceive of concepts and objects. Plausibly, whether hypothetically we are fixated on culture or not can be characterized as something which makes a culture. Yet, it's not something people have, but something they construct in specific human encounters where mutual relations and power are part of the ambience. Through the lens of research, it appears in this ambience that fixation is a behavior, and in our cognitive skills, if you do have a problematic behavior or fixation on a particular object or habit, there are things that you can do to overcome such tendencies. According to Kendra Sherry, behavior, cognitive, and cognitive behavioral therapies are often used to develop newer, more productive thought and behavior patterns. Hypothetically, if we are really fixated on culture, then it has to do with the time frame and the linguistic meaning of the time each global citizen would have or engages in this practice. Abstractly speaking, sometimes I wonder if fixation comports itself in a way like motion. According to the physics hypertext book, motion results in a change of location, is said to be transitional. This category may seem ridiculous at first, as motion implies a change in location. But an object can be moving and yet not go anywhere. Motion is the action of changing location or position. A case in point, in cases where no refixation occurs, the eyes simply retain at the same location until the word is identified, and for a duration that is constant and independent of The fixation location, a view espoused by Francois Vittoer, George W. M. McConkie, Paul Kerr, and J. Kevin O. Ragnar. Further, the study of motion without regard to the forces or energies that may be involved is called kinematics. It is the simplest branch of mechanics, the branch of mechanics that deals with both motion and forces together are called dynamics, and the study of forces in the presence of changes in motion or energy is called statistics. Theoretically speaking, the physics hypertext book statement requires deep thinking. In this ambience, I am conscious that if I have a problematic behavior or fixation on a particular object or habit, there are things that I can do to overcome such tendencies. According to Kendra Sherry, behavior, cognitive, and cognitive behavioral therapies are often used to develop newer, more productive thought and behavior patterns. If we are really fixated on culture, then it has to do with the time frame and the logistics, meaning, and the time each global citizen would have or engages in this practice. Figuratively and literally speaking through my cognitive lens, the linguistic construct fixated is a transitive verb. However, in this ambience, abstractly speaking, it becomes the platform in time, the cultural geographical space of focus, and the act of fixating. This clarification provides another angle of culture, since it is also viewed as dynamic and thus complex, because it is fluid rather than static, which means that it changes all the time, every day, in subtle and tangible ways. This thinking engages my attention because for something or someone to be fluid and static, always changing all the time, every day, in subtle and tangible ways, implies change is always happening. In addition, we accept change as inevitable, and it is end of story, right? Well, not exactly. In the scheme of things, hypothetically, if we are fixated on culture, then it's perceived as a social change. According to sociologists, social change as changes in human interactions and relationships that transform cultural and social institutions. These changes, such as this question, hypothetically, are we fixated on culture, then it obviously would have occurred over time and often have profound and long-term consequences for society. Viewing this question through another lens from a different angle is an idiom about perspective, and I suppose can make things look differently from the perspective of a student of film and media arts specialist. I will confess that a telephotic lens makes things appear closer together and gives greater detail and specifics, while a wide-angle lens gets more things in the view. This explanation, juxtaposed against culture, seems to have a different influence on global citizens in every part of the world. How we perceive things are largely affected by our judgment skills, preconceived notions, attitude, and emotions. These factors are closely linked with our culture. In perceiving something as good or bad, our biases play a role, and so does our way of thinking. In judging something as easy or difficult, our attitude and our motivation levels play a key role. And this is the reason why our culture determines the structure of our thinking. Hypothetically, if we are fixated on culture, that it has to do with our behavioral patterns, belief systems, principles, and ways of living, which are the derivatives of our culture. Andre Milor joins the conversation and advocates a different perspective. Mulroy further elaborates, I quote, "Culture is the sum of all the forms of art, of love, and of thought, which, in the course of centuries, have enabled man to be less enslaved." End quote. In all probability, if this question, hypothetically, are we fixated on culture, is invisible and a pattern of human activity or behavior of some members of a community represent in culture. Perhaps, hypothetically, if we are fixated on culture, presumably it may have something to do with the fact that our cultural values and beliefs are influenced by how we approach living, which is being manifest through our lifestyle. Maybe fixated on culture is just a hypothetical perception. However, there is no denying that culture affects perception, and perceptions drive behavior. Thus, the culture we belong to has a direct impact on our behavior. Moreover, our environment, which has cultural influences, shapes our behavior. How we perceive things are largely affected by our judgment skills, preconceived notions, attitude, and emotions. These factors are closely linked with our culture. In perceiving something as good or bad, our biases play a role, and so does our way of thinking. In judging something as easy or difficult, our attitude and our motivation levels play a key role. Our culture determines the structure of our thinking, which influences our perceptions. What our culture teaches us affects the way we interact socially. People from some cultures are found to be more open in communicating, even with strangers or new acquaintances, while those from other conservative cultures may not be so open. The difference between ideologies their cultures have are thus evident in their social behavior. People who belong to cultures that promote individualism tend to look at only the main aspect of a situation, while those of a culture that promotes collectivism tend to consider even the minor details. Hypothetically, if we are fixated on culture, then almost every facet of life, it's important to recognize the differences in culture. People who live around us, those we socialize with, and the ones we work with come from different parts of the world and have different cultures. Their ways of thinking and living and their values and beliefs are different from ours. We learn to appreciate others and not disrespect them. But the pertinent question still remains to be answered. Hypothetically, are we fixated on culture? The irony in this discourse is that as verbs, the difference between fixated and fixed is that fixated is fixed, while fixed is fixed. As adjectives, the difference between fixated and fixed is that fixated is psychology, attached to someone or something in a neurotic or pathological manner, while fixed is not changing, not able to be changed, saying the same. In grappling with this way of thinking, distinguishing and initiating what is culture and what is fixated are analyzed to ascertain whether there is also a symbiotic relationship existing between culture and fixation. Who determines culture and what is fixated, and at what point can an individual become fixated, and whether there are stages of fixation within culture? So, plausibly, when I communicate, and if I am fixated on that something, then I can become overly focused on it or attached to it. A case in point. According to Zenzi M. Griffith and Catherine Block, I quote, "When speaking extemporaneously, speakers began fixating pictured elements less than a second before naming them within their descriptions, consistent with incremental lexical encoding. Therefore, to affecting how people behave, culture influences how they adapt to an environment. End quote. Through the lens of a media arts specialist and licensed cultural practitioner, what could very well happen? People may not be necessarily hypothetically fixated on culture, a verb, but the components of culture, namely the beliefs, values, behavior, and material objects that constitute a people's way of life. Abraham Lincoln's presidential rejection of constitutional fixation stemmed from a change in the purpose of his constitutional arguments rather than an abandonment of his previous understanding concerning the nature of that constitution. The problem with the constitutional rhetoric of fixation has little to do with the interpretive struggles between originalists of all stripes, living constitutionalists, and those who claim to practice both simultaneously. These can have a profound impact on how people display, perceive, and experience emotions. The culture in which we live provides structure, guidelines, expectations, and rules to help us understand and interpret various emotions. Hypothetically, if we are fixated on culture, then it may be perceived as expressing emotions. A cultural display rule dictates the types and frequencies of emotional displays considered acceptable within a certain culture. Maltese and Haviland, 1982. These rules may also guide how people choose to regulate their emotions, ultimately influencing an individual's emotional experience and leading to general cultural differences in the experience and display of emotion. In the scheme of things, let us accept the fact that we are really fixated on culture, whether it is consciously or unconsciously. Since culture is not a fixed subject, but culture establishes common interests, beliefs, ethics, habits, and values among society members. Culture is interchanged with people. Culture is dynamic and thus complex. Culture is fluid rather than static, which means that culture changes all the time, every day, in subtle and tangible ways. Because humans communicate and express their cultural systems in a variety of ways, it can be hard to pinpoint exactly what cultural dynamics are at play. But all global citizens are fixated on some aspect of culture at some point during their cultural journey. Fixated on culture is an idiom and a metaphor and is deemed a figure of speech in this context. Although the formal definition, a metaphor, according to Grammar Monster, is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase, yet in this ambience, it is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Figuratively and literally speaking, through my cognitive lens, the linguistic construct fixated is a transitive verb. However, in this ambience, abstractly speaking, it becomes the platform in time, the cultural geographical space of focus, and the act of fixating. When the proverbial dust is settled, the conscious mind contains all of the thoughts, memories, feelings, and wishes of which we are aware at any given moment concerning whether, hypothetically, we are fixated on culture or not. However, the unconscious contains contents that are unacceptable or unpleasant, such as feelings of pain, anxiety, or conflict. Therefore, the term whether hypothetically we are fixated on culture or not suggests that there is a strong plausibility that culture may have something to do with a shared set of beliefs, attitudes, norms, values, and behavior organized around a central theme and found among speakers of one language in one time period and in one geographic region. Finally, hypothetically, whether we are fixated on culture or not is a question that requires deep thinking, which is an intellectual conversation, and my story, which is captured in 9 chapters and framed in ISBN 9781 63760 8890.